Hi everyone, this is Raj, and this is how I created a game engine from scratch in Python. Here I'm using Visual Studio Code. You can use any editor of your choice. I started by defining a Python 3.8 virtual environment and also adding the keyboard package to requirement.txt to get keyboard inputs. So we will start by creating a folder named engine and making it a module by defining an init file. Now the first object or the class that we will be needing in an engine is a game object. You can think of a game object is like a real object in real life, but it's in the game world. Now it has all the properties like transform and all sort of properties are belonging to a game object. Everything in game world is a game object. So before we define the game object, we should define all the properties that it will be holding. So I think the first property that it can hold is a transform property. So let's make a file called game object first, and then defining a class called transform. The transform property will hold some of the properties like the x value here. It will be the x-axis and y-axis position in the coordinate plane of 2D. Because we are not creating a 3D engine, it will require a lot more coding and a lot more complication than creating a 2D engine. So this will be a 2D engine. So and the y coordinate, and then moving forward we need a width to get the dimension. We will start by defining it as 0 and height will also be 0. This object is just a point in space by default. Then we want the scale x, it will be 1 because we want at least it is scaled 1:1, and scale y, so it will be 1 by 1 in scaling. That means it will not be shrinking or it not be. I'm also defining some of the properties here like the center and how to change the position and dimension and scale here. So I will fast forward it. So I basically defined three methods here. First is the center, second is change position. For changing the position, it will just set the x and y values of this transform. Then there is a dimension change for changing the width and height, and also the scale change for changing the scale factor of the game object on which this transform is attached. Now I should definitely make this center a property by using the property decorator. So I think we can define a game object right now. I imported the ABC library here. This is the abstract base class so that we can create an abstract class of the game object here. First of all, I will just mark it as we are creating a game object class from here, and I will define an abstract game object, and it will be extending from the ABC class or the abstract base class. Now I will define some of the properties that we will be needed in every game object. First of all is the transform property that we define above. I am also annotating it so that it can help the interpreter or this editor to suggest its suggestions. Now the other property that can be handy is a tag. Tag is just a type of string that will be helpful for identifying the current game object. For example, if a game object is a bullet, the tag can be bullet, or if a game object is a type of player, then we can tag it with a player. Now I will just start with it none so that it can also be none, and also we can also define a name. The name property is pretty useful in finding a game object in the tree of game object. So next step will be defining the transform property here. So I will be using a private property here. I will just name it transform, and then just mark it with transform so that it can hold a transform value, and we'll save the transform here, or if transform is null, I will be saving the by default. Now the next step will be, I will just mark self dot tag. I will just mark it with tag, and also self dot name will be equals to name. So we are finished with the initialization here, and I should just remove these spaces here. Now we will be moving to the properties of how to access these properties first of all. So just make some of the properties here. I will just fast forward it so that I can create the getters of transform, tag and name here. So I defined the three of the getters here, transform, tag and name, to get all these private properties from this game object. Also I think that these tag can be a list, because a game object can hold a list of tags. For example, you have three kind of enemies and you want to tag them enemy, and also enemy 1, enemy 2 and enemy 3, so that they are enemies but they are also from different categories. So a tag can be used in that way too. So I will be making a list of string here. So for help of typing, I will be using from typing import list, and then I will just annotate it with list and just mark it with string, so that it will be a list of strings, or otherwise it will be null. So I will just make it an empty list here. So this is the basic diagram of how a game engine actually works. The step goes like this. First, the loading stage. Here in the loading stage, all the assets are being loaded to the memory. Then the second stage is starting the game loop. A game loop is simply an infinite loop that will run forever, and on each iteration it will just call the input, update and render method on each game object that is available on your current screen. As you can see that each game object required at least 3 of these methods. One is the input, second is the update, and last one is the render. So we are going to code these first. So we are back to the code editor now, and we will continue by defining the input method that will be used for handling the inputs. For example, the keyboard, the mouse movements or the joystick. I am just passing it, for example, if a game object is not handling any input. For example, if it is an enemy, then the enemy is not controlled by user, so the input method will be none. So in that case, the enemy won't be handling the input method. So we will continue by defining the next method in our list, that is update, which will be called infinite number of times every second. That will totally dependent on your computer or the hardware. This will be used for calculation like collision detection or translations or animations. Now the next method will be render. The render method is used for generating the graphics based on the current properties of this game object. I'm also defining another method called the fixed update. On engines like Unity or Unreal, you will find that there is another method called fixed update. Now this method is used for generating, or this method is just being called a fixed number of times every second. For example, if your game is running at 60 FPS, then this method will be called 60 times in a second. So I will name it fixed update. I'm again going to pass it because this will be handled in its subclass. So we will start by defining the concrete class for our abstract game object. So I'm naming it as game object simply, and I will write abstract game object here. And this, let me just first define all the Now moving down, we also need some of the properties for the game object. For example, I will be needing a started property. For example, I will mark it self.started equals to false, and self.destroyed equals to false. So these two are the flags which will tell us that whether this game object is on the screen right now by using the started flag, on screen, and removed from screen. This will help us in removing the garbage values here and there, which will be spread out when you run the game object in a loop. So if your enemies died, then the object is still alive, so we want to destroy that object so that we can clear out the memory. So we will be using these two flags to handle that. So after that, I'm just defining two methods here. First is the start, which will be called when this object is set up for being initialized on the next frame. Now the first step that it will do is mark the started equals to true, and there will be another method called destroy, which will mark this object to be destroyed on next iteration of the game loop. Now destroyed will be equals to true when we call this method. Now the timeline will go like this. I'll just make one here. So this is the timeline of our game object. It starts, it handles input, then the update, then the fixed update if there is any, then there will be a render method, and after that if the object is being marked as destroyed and removed from the screen. Since the video is already quite long, I think I should move to the second part. There will be around 6 to 7 videos in series, and I will be uploading daily, so it will take around a week to complete. So be subscribed to this channel and also press that bell button if you want to get latest notification on this series.